Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a yoga teacher, a mom of three, entrepreneur, and forever curious student. This podcast is recorded on the traditional lands and treaty territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, which consists of the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation. In case you are brand new to the podcast and this is the first episode that you're listening to, well, first of all, welcome. And let me tell you a bit of the backstory of why it was created. Mainly because I really understand what it feels like to be out in the wilderness of teaching yoga and running a business. I remember what it was like to leave yoga teacher training and just think, oh my gosh, there's so much more to learn about not only running a business, but also so much more to learn about yoga and especially the philosophy of yoga. That is why I'm so excited for today's episode and for us to learn from an amazing yoga teacher, practitioner, and philosopher. We've had Shyam on the podcast before, so I'll make sure to link to that episode in our show notes. And what I really appreciate about today's interview and all of the work that Shyam does is it's very applicable to our life right now as humans. Sometimes we can get a little bit worried, or maybe that's me. I can get a little bit worried when I hear the word philosophy and it feels like, oh gosh, this is going to be really overwhelming or not really apply. It's just sort of like out in the ethers. But that's not the way Shyam explains philosophy and doing decolonizing or anti-colonial work or yoga. So let's get ready to dive into this. First, I want to tell you today's episode is powered by OfferingTree. I use and love this software in my own business because it automates everything. So when someone books a podcast interview, we use OfferingTree. If someone books like a yoga class with me or a consultation call, I use OfferingTree. And I love that they can do bookings, payments, Zoom links, reminders go out, and we have a special podcast listener discount code for you over at OfferingTree.com/Shannon. Also, the team over at OfferingTree, they are amazing folks, and I'm just really honored to have worked with them for so long. And I'm incredibly grateful that they have sponsored the podcast, that they pay for episodes to come out to you for free. So if you are on social media this week, tag OfferingTree and tell them that you're having a listen to the podcast and thank them for supporting this. Okay, so in today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, who is a philosopher, author, and leading voice in anti-colonial philosophy. And we're talking about the deep connections between decolonial thought and the practice of yoga. Shyam's work challenges the colonial narratives that still shape how we both approach philosophy and yoga today. We dig into ideas from his book, which is called Yoga, Anti-Colonial Philosophy. Oh my gosh, Connected Yoga Teachers. I highly recommend getting a hold of this book. In that book, he explores how yoga, at its roots, is a decolonial tradition and how reconnecting with that legacy can reshape the way we teach, learn, and practice. And as I said, I really appreciate how Shyam brings it into the right here and now. Like what is going on in our life right now as humans, as messy, messy humans, because we're all, we all have stuff going on from like the patterns that we keep repeating, that keep showing up. And we're like, why is this happening to me? To like activism and taking a stand for things and why this is yoga. So it's very relevant to today's time. And I also really appreciate in this conversation thinking about like, what is my work to do on myself? Not to do with, trying to fix everyone around me or fix the planet, but like, what is my work? Also, I want to say this conversation inspired me to look at how philosophy can be a tool for liberation. So let's dive in and have a listen to Shyam's wisdom today. Welcome back to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, Shyam. It's so great to see you here today.
Thanks for having me back. So happy to speak to you.
Congratulations on your book. It's amazing. I was just telling you before we hit record that I was getting caught up in it and I was like, oh, wait, I have to go do something else. I have to set a timer to read this book.
I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you.
And it's very applicable to modern day as well. So thank you for that.
Oh, I'm glad. Good. Why else would you? I think the interesting thing about learning about yoga is that it is timeless. And so it's not like we're going back in time. It's the same issues we always have to face as people, the choices we have to make, the options we're confronted with. So, I think it's more relevant than most things because it really gets down to this very basic challenge we have as persons.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay. So I have so many questions, like probably too many for a podcast, but I'm going to fit in as many as I can. But before we do that, in case our listeners haven't read your book or didn't, or if they missed your last podcast episode, other than being in trouble, we'll link to it in the show notes. Tell our listeners, what's the work that you do and who do you do it for?
Yeah. So I run yoga philosophy. So my day job has been a philosophy professor for years, but I started yoga philosophy in 2019, and the idea was to have scholarly but scholar practitioner information about yoga and philosophy available to yoga practitioners. I'm an unusual person. I'm actually a trained philosopher. And so there are a lot of people who write on yoga, but they don't know what philosophy is. So, I can't in a way blame them for not understanding it, but they also don't really, they're also not interested. So I find that really annoying. Why go to all this trouble to say you're interested in yoga, but not really be interested in learning about the discipline that makes understanding it possible. So I'm a little odd that way in the field. And my work was already kind of decolonial. I was interested in the ways in which people don't really want to learn from or listen to philosophy from colonized traditions because it challenges all these pretenses we have in our world. And so I thought, well, I was actually surprised. I wasn't particularly expecting anybody to be interested in my work, but some people are. And then I got encouraged to write this book, and there you have it. So you can find me at yogaphilosophy.com. And also my new book is Yoga Anti-Colonial Philosophy.
So how did you choose the title of your book? Was it easy to choose the title?
Actually, credit goes to Singing Dragon, because I was initially introduced to them as someone who could write like a book about that could be used in a yoga teacher training as like the yoga humanities textbook. So it covers everything you would need to cover in that. But, I also just told them, like, my work is always decolonial. Like, it's just kind of how I do my work. And they were like, well, why don't we make that part of the title? I'm like, okay. So that's how that happened. It was actually very, I was pleasantly surprised that, that was how they wanted to lead with it. And it certainly helped me in the writing of it, like having that as the title.
Yeah. Oh, it's great. Also, I like that it could be used in a yoga teacher training. I could see that very clearly reading it, especially with the questions at the follow-up of the chapter of here are some great questions. And just reading back through those questions, I was like, oh yeah, oh, these are good. So I hope yoga teacher trainers grab this book and use it for sure. Okay, one thing that you wrote about in the book, which I know is there, is South Asian yoga teachers, South Asian authors and voices, and BIPOC authors and teachers and voices are not who we're really learning from. Me as a white yoga teacher, that's not who I've been introduced to, with a lot of philosophy.
Yeah.
And you just spoke to that. So why is that? And what's the implication of what happens when that happens?
Yeah. So I actually think that I think we should learn from people who know what they're talking about. And that's not the same as someone who's just ethnically South Asian, right? So being ethnically South Asian doesn't get you any I write about this in the foreword. Like, I think what goes on is people just kind of show up and then they say whatever comes to mind, and then that's yoga. And then I think that if you have a South Asian person doing that, there's a slightly higher chance that what they say might be relevant, only because it's part of the background that they're inheriting. But I do think that really the fact that we are not interested in learning from people who know what they're talking about is a reflection of a kind of insecurity where we would rather learn from people who don't force us to learn. We would rather just have our assumptions echo back to us. And so even I write about this in the book, like you would think that there's this academic study of yoga out there, and there is, but it's filled with people who are like not interested or trained in philosophy. And they say things like, I don't understand what the Yoga Sutra says. And they're still counted as authorities because they have a way of re-emphasizing the kind of assumptions and prejudices that come to us in the world we live in. So I think that we're not. So the fact that most people just gravitate towards other white teachers in the West, like I know a lot of people say, "Oh, you should go learn from a South Asian teacher." I'm like, well, do they know? Like, I wouldn't say that. I would say go learn from someone who knows what they're talking. But I think the fact that people do self-select in this way speaks to a kind of an actual fear of learning. So they would rather relate to the person that's teaching, quote unquote, them. So seem familiar. You can relate to their biography, right? It makes it less threatening because it's more like, oh, I'm I've studied yoga for years and I've, done my 200-hour, 300 hours, and and the more people just seem like that, the more like, oh, I feel comfortable. Like there's a kind of sense of like, but it's wild because the assumption is that if you actually find someone who knows what they're talking about, you won't understand, which is not true. Like if they really understand, they can simplify things for you. But I think there's this deep-seated fear
That
of actually
makes so
learning.
much sense. Yeah. And this just calls to mind a couple of times, like when I've had guests on and we've talked about transphobia or
Right.
racism, then people are saying to me, "Can you just explain like what you learned?" I'm like, "No, no, no, you need to go learn from people who specialize in this work." And they're like, "Can you just like cuz I learn better from you."
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And I appreciate that, like, if it
Yeah.
opens the door and that this is the
Yes.
beautiful thing about the podcast is because I can sit here and just ask what that's all I have is questions, really.
Hmm.
Ask the questions, that maybe people are afraid to ask.
I think people. I mean, one thing that I've come to appreciate is that what we call education, especially in the West, but the world we live in now, is not really education. It's geared to getting us to follow instruction. So when we're young, we're curious, we have all sorts of questions, and then that's beaten out of us. So by the time people come to their 20s, when they are likely to start learning about yoga, this has already been frightened out of them. The curiosity, the willingness to explore and learn something new. They've been programmed into thinking that, to be a good boy and girl is to just do what you're told. So, that's how you get the grade and the sticker and whatnot. And philosophy is frightening because, like, it's exactly what we're discouraged to do, what we want to do when we're kids. And I think that's also why older people and people who've been practicing for a while, they come back to it because they overcome that programming, and they also start to see the ways in which it just didn't support them, right? Like, all right, maybe it helped me get a job to just do this whole, but now I'm in this horrible job. I don't like. You can think about all the ways in which you do what you're told, and then you're like, hold on, I've just been like scammed, or there's something missing, or so I use, I don't think that it's that we can't do this kind of learning, but we're discouraged to, and that has to do with colonization, right? Because colonization is really about just not having options, having one view forced on you and you having to conform. And so, insofar as we live in this colonized world, we're discouraged to do philosophy. We're discouraged to ask these questions and to do it rigorously. It feels we've been programmed to be scared of it.
So true. Oh my gosh, I was just having a conversation with my uncle this week where I said to him, when did you know this about this social issue that we were talking about? Like, because I was like, I didn't know this when I was younger. Like, why, why are we just figuring this out now? He didn't really answer my question of like when he learned that. But it's interesting when you say it's later on in life where we start to question things a little bit more or start to be more philosophical or get curious again.
Will we allow ourselves to go back to what we were like when we were kids, right? I think because that kind of programming it wears off after a while. Not for everybody, but by and large, I never understood why most of my students are older people, like in the yoga world, and new yoga students are like completely frightened. And then I realized they're just scared. They're scared. They've been told it's a bad thing, to ask questions and to think critically and to use logic. It's been really kind of frightened out of them.
Right. Oh my gosh. So, what I love about your book is that it is really applicable to now. We have a lot of social justice issues we're facing in the world. We have a
Yeah.
lot of like, we're watching a genocide. We're
Yes.
watching, like, as you and I are talking, there's about to be a hurricane hit Florida that's like unprecedented.
Yes.
And climate change is like landing literally on the doorstep of many people.
Right.
I'm seeing a tremendous rise in Islamophobia right now.
Yeah.
How does yoga and many other things, like there's so many things right now, transphobia,
Mhm.
homophobia, like a lot. How does how does the practice of yoga help us to fight
Right.
these things that we're like, no, that's wrong. Like,
So the basis of yoga is devotion to Ishvara sovereignty. That's like the central practice. And to be devoted to sovereignty is that you take on. To be devoted to sovereignty is to also take on the practice of its essential traits. So Ishvara is defined in two traits. It's not stuck in its past. So it doesn't have baggage. Um, and then it's also unafflicted moving forward. It's able to kind of move into the future. So there's like a freedom from the past and a freedom to move into the future. And so when we practice yoga in book 2, first thing potentially does is he defines yoga as a 3-part activity. So there's devotion to Ishvara, and then you practice its essential traits of unconservatism, tapas, and swadhyaya, self-governance. And to engage in this practice of devotion to Ishvara is also then to have an insight into what we all share, which is an interest in Ishvara. All of us have an interest in independence, because what it is to thrive as a person is to be able to live without baggage and to be able to move into the future. So when you start to engage in this practice, you are able to see like we all share the same interest. And so there's this radical politics of like solidarity with all people. But in the South Asian tradition, like when you start to realize that what it is to thrive is to be unconservative and self-governing, that's true of squirrels and the earth. And so the Western tradition is a very anthropocentric tradition, and it tries to get us to think about ourselves in terms of our specific linguistic community. Language is kind of the basic model of thinking in the Western tradition. So ethno-linguistic identity becomes like the main sense of who you are in this tradition. And then religion is actually invented by the West. I talk about this as it spreads colonially, and then that adds like a layer of like ethno-linguist to the ethno-linguistic identity. But then if we're in yoga, what that's an example of is being devoted not to Ishvara or independence or sovereignty, but to your thoughts and feelings. So we can either be devoted to Ishvara sovereignty, or we can be devoted to our experiences and our beliefs and our fears. And whenever we have a very limiting view of who we are in terms of our family history or ethnic identity, that's a sense of self that's not abstract, something we all share. It's very particularly the kinds of experiences that the people around you talk about or have. Um, and so, when these are just, this kind of, we have to choose. Either we can be devoted to Ishvara or we are devoted to these very specific local experiences and group identity. And so when you look at the problems that we're having today, they're explainable not by devotion to Ishvara, but the fact that people get so caught up in their little narrow sense of who they are. And then if that's what you think you are, everyone who doesn't fit with that seems like a threat. So then everybody who's not part of your in group all of a sudden is someone you see them as people who don't respect your way of life, right? And so then all of a sudden they become people you have to occupy, destroy, marginalize. Climate change. How does climate change happen? Happens because humans act like they're the only ones that count, right? Not the earth, not other animals. And so all these problems come from the same poison, really, which is this very narrow anthropocentric, and I call it communitarian, this idea that like we're defined by our community and then our species. This creates all the problems that you've talked about, every single one of them, because we
So,
can't act in a way that's reasonable for all of us.
right. So when you talk about Ishra, I and like I feel like I've tried to really learn this. Can you help me out here and like explain to me like I'm really someone who's brand new to it, or actually someone who's in elementary school?
Sure.
Because like with an example of like here's one way to act like this and here's the other way.
Okay. So Ishra, first of all, it's an abstraction. Okay. It's an ideal. And it's the ideal of being free from your past so you can move into your future. So, think about someone with a bunch of issues and prejudices. They're not free from their past. They're stuck to all those prejudices and beliefs. And maybe some of them, they have some evidence for it, right? Maybe, they're a green person and every blue person they met was mean to them or so. Like, it doesn't mean that there isn't some evidence for it. But if we define ourselves in terms of those experiences, we never allow ourselves to be independent. We're stuck there, right? So every kind of bigotry or small-mindedness is part of just not being free from those past experiences. So that's why we have to practice tapas, where we challenge ourselves, right? And there's a physical challenge, but there's also the intellectual challenge of getting over our prejudices and our samskaras. That's what it's called in the yoga tradition. So anytime you see someone who's acting in this very kind of xenophobic way, they're failing to be like Ishvara insofar as they're stuck in the past. But also, when we're devoted to Ishvara, we're also taking responsibility for our choices and allowing ourselves to live a life in accordance to choices. But when people are stuck with their prejudices, they're not choosing, their belief system is choosing, right? So they actually end up undermining their own capacity to choose because they're stuck with this view. And so instead of living on their own terms, they live this traumatic experience, right? The whole world is against them. The whole world is not their friend. And, everything is dangerous. There's there's no way to just kind of choose.
Is there
So
a
that would be,
practice to come out of this? Is there a practice that we can do?
yes, it's
Yeah.
called devotion to Ishvara. And then you have to challenge yourself. And then also, so you have to do the tapas and swadhyaya. And then potentially gives the 8 limbs as an upaya, as a remedy for when you're having trouble with practice. You have to first create an environment that's safe for people. That's the yamas, right? Where everybody's boundaries are respected. And then you can reaffirm your commitment to the practice and work on it. But that's what the Yoga Sutras completely about, right? What do we do? given that we all have history. We're all born with history, right? Like each one of us has genes that came from somewhere. They weren't just invented with us. They came from, so there's a history to that. We inherit our families' issues and problems, and now scientists are doing work on epigenetics, and like you can pass down traumatic experiences to generate, like we come into this world with history. So then how do we live as independent people, right? So that's the challenge, and it's not by just believing or identifying with everything that's like the fact of our life. We have to do something very transformative and radical. Otherwise, we're just stuck with how things are.
Yeah, I just heard of this study that they were doing. I think it was with mice, where there was like, I don't know, it's probably some traumatic thing that happened to the mother mouse. Or then generations later, the same mice had this same reaction. I forget what the study was. And that just goes to show that as beings, we store this.
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So this is the problem we have, right? So then how are we going to, so we have to then have a practice that gets us not stuck in our past and challenging us to own our own choices, right? We have to choose that.
Right. Okay, you talked about samskaras. Is that, talk to us about what that is first.
It's a word, it literally means a rite or ritual, but in yoga, it refers to these patterns we have of like interpreting the world in accordance with experiences. And so then we kind of we self-enforce a perspective on ourselves and everything. And then we can only allow ourselves to understand what conforms to that perspective. And so the result is we create these self-fulfilling patterns in life where we're constantly reliving the same issues, insofar as we're always using those issues as a way to understand all the possibilities. So we never allow ourselves an alternative. And so we're always recreating those kinds of issues for ourselves, right? And so you can use a samskara on purpose. You could decide, for instance, like if you're a couch potato, you're going to create a new one of going to the gym, and that's going to be like your habit. But we're playing with, it can be useful, but then that could become the new problem. And I talk to yoga people who are like, their fetish for their asana practice becomes an issue at some point when they get older. They can't do what they used to be able to do. So now they have a new issue, which is the samskara they created for their asana practice, which would have been a great idea at the time, but now it takes on this life of its own, right? So all of these are ways in which we don't live independently. And we can set up patterns in the short term, which are like antidotes to other patterns, and that can be useful for a time. But if we are not always in charge, they rule us.
Right.
And then we become these just predictable pathologies, really.
I just think of like the analogy, I don't know who said it to me, of like walking on a path, and you walk that same path, and then it gets really like it's deeper. That path is deeper, and it's hard to step out of that path, like kind of like.
Right. So what happens, book 2, sutra 3. So when we're ignorant and we're not allowing ourselves to practice Ishvara Pranidhana, when we are devoted to Ishvara, we allow ourselves to like itemize options and choose. But when we're ignorant, we think that we're stuck with like our experiences and the way the world is. And what that does is it creates a false sense of safety within a very narrow range of experiences. And then we're scared. We're only happy when the world affirms it, and we're scared when it doesn't. And so we restrict ourselves. And this is what trauma, klesha, is, or results in klesha, and potentially calls that fear of death. We get so agoraphobic, we get so stuck in the specific experience as though that's the only safe place for us to be. We don't allow ourselves to do anything else. And then instead of actually living life and taking smart chances, we limit ourselves.
This is making me think of a friend of mine who was like, "Oh my gosh, is this the way my dating life is always going to look?" That's what she was saying. She's like, "What is happening? Like, is this the universe?"
Right.
Maybe it's samskaras.
That's right. there's no universe. I mean, that's a way of kind of not so that what happens is we don't see our agency when we're in these patterns and loops, because our agency is hidden by these patterns, but our agency is what's powering it. So we have to find a way to redeploy our agency. So that's another reason to just focus on the devotion to Ishvara. The more you focus on the patterns, the more you're empowering them. The more you can put your attention into something else, you start creating different kinds of options for yourself.
Yeah. And people do this not only like the universe narrative, but it's also like, oh, look what God did to me. Or
Oh
like,
yeah, sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
this is just
For
what I've been
sure. Oh yeah,
handed.
anything to just avoid looking at what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. I mean, not everything is in our control, but like if you keep kind of running around in the same patterns, and this is the other thing I do mention in the book, there is like systemic oppression is a real thing.
Right.
And so we're not the only person. So other people's samskaras can severely impact us too. So the fact that they're stuck and they don't really move out of the way or allow us to do what we need to, like other people can be an obstacle too. But if at least you're taking back your own agency, you're allowing yourself to like not buy their story of the world, right? And so it's not that everything is under your control, but if you don't actually, take seriously what little agency you have, you're definitely giving it up to everything else. And then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. Okay, I'm gonna make sure my friend listens to this, and I need to listen to it again when I'm like, why am I seeing this again in my life? Hey, connected yoga teachers, I'm popping in here for a moment to give a shout out of thank you to OfferingTree. And I first want to ask you a question. Like, do you ever feel like, oh, I have an abundance of time. I can just spend time like it doesn't even matter? Or have you been feeling like, gosh, I don't have enough time? Well, this is one of the reasons why I use and love OfferingTree. It's this one-stop place for scheduling things like keeping track of your calendar, receiving online payments, building a website, storing your videos, and it means that you actually spend less time on admin and more time sharing yoga. And I also want to remind you that if you're checking it out, make sure to use our special podcast listener discount. That's offeringtree.com/Shannon. They also have a 14-day trial and amazing support. So if you have questions about OfferingTree, head over to offeringtree.com, try out the 14-day trial, but make sure to also use the discount code that all of our podcast listeners get. Again, that's offeringtree.com/Shannon. Alrighty, let's get back into our conversation with Shyam. There were a couple of quotes that I wrote down. One is simply practicing yoga is the easiest way to disrupt its harm of colonialism.
The harm of colonialism?
Yeah, the harm of colonialism.
Yeah, for sure. Colonization is about this enforcement of like just one option on us. And yoga, when we're practicing, it starts with basically it's about understanding options, making options clear so that we can choose. That's what it is for us to be engaged in this devotion to sovereignty, right? There are options. I get to choose. It's not like things are being enforced on. So practicing yoga is in an anti-colonial practice because you can't be allowing yourself options and choosing and also be coerced at the same time. Like one has to give. Either you are under someone else's thumbs or you're actually making clear what you can do and then choosing yourself. And that's why the outcome of this practice is kaivalya, autonomy. And you can't be working on your autonomy and also being colonized at the same time. So there's something has to give. And if you're putting energy into your yoga practice, you're decolonizing yourself.
So many So many little examples are popping up into my mind. A lot of it is around gardening because that just feels like gardening and food production has really been colonized. And for me, it's easy to see, like, when a friend's like, "Oh, yeah, we can't save seeds. That's not allowed anymore." I just feel like this inner rebel in me be like, "What? Like, everyone has to be able to save seeds. That has to be, like, just a." And so I feel like there's a
So
real
they believe they can't do it?
there are laws in some
Oh,
countries where
yes.
people are not allowed to save seeds.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. You can still do it.
I know, I'm
Don't
like,
tell anybody.
do it," but I start to sound like I'm just always like, my friends will joke with me, like, "You're becoming an anarchist," or, like, "You're really challenging."
Right.
And I'm do you think that's part of it? Do you think it's, like, this real challenging of what's going on now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, insofar as, a law is a law because there's a certain process by which it comes into effect. That doesn't make it a good idea or the right thing for us. So, this is called legal positivism. It's a theory of law that says that, well, there's a kind of process by which something becomes a law. And we can understand something as a law that's in effect. And if we understand those kind of very dry procedures that make it a law, we can understand the moral question of whether we should obey it or not as a completely separate question, right? And there's a reason that so like protest and disruption and revolution are these yogic practices because your primary devotion is to Ishvara, not to laws. So the difference between a yogi who's disruptive and someone else is that a yogi is disruptive in a way that's good for everybody, and other people are just in it for themselves. So this is partly discussed in the chapter on the Bhagavad Gita. Like a lot of people read that just on its own. There's a whole backstory of how the Pandavas get to this war, and they were trying very hard to be good people, and they got taken for a ride by bad people. But part of their weakness was they were trying so hard to just conform to expectations of what it is to be a good person that they allow themselves to be completely taken for a ride, because the other side doesn't care about you, right? They're just there to fleece you. So then at some point we have to stand up for ourselves, and that is a kind of disruptive event, but it's the kind that's good for everyone. So I think that's like a really important lesson from yoga. It's not like, when you decide that you're going to engage in some type of protest, you're being destructive, right? You're actually making space for people, but it does disrupt institutionalized harm. It does do that. That's the point.
Mhm. Thank you for bringing protests into that because sometimes people are like, "Oh, that can't be associated with yoga." And I'm like, "It most definitely
Well, they
is."
fought. There's a whole lecture on a battlefield before people are like gutted and killed, and Krishna's delivering these lectures on yoga, and people block that out. I'm like, they're going to fight a fight, and he's like trying to get Arjuna to fight a fight, and if you're not following the argument, of course you won't understand what it has to do with yoga. But then I feel like you're just making stuff up. You've decided you know what you it's just stuff you're making up. You're not actually looking at the reasons that people in this tradition really made explicit. It's not even a metaphor, right? They made explicit as kind of what's involved in being devoted to Ishvara. Like, why should you be a doormat? Why should you let other people get the better of you, right? Like, that doesn't mean, we live in this world where people are so, this has to do with colonization. Your being an individual is problematized. So individualism is treated as a dirty word, right? And you're supposed to be concerned about the group and stuff. That's just the colonizers' playbook. They want group identity only. They don't want individuals. And so, this is really, well, understanding yoga also means we have to kind of decolonize these weird ideas that we have that we can't or shouldn't stand up for ourselves and others.
Yeah. Okay. The other quote was yoga, the real philosophical practice, is what one does where one already is in relationship to the people that are already in one's life. And I love that it's about what we're doing and it's also about our relationships.
Yeah. This is something I just loved when I started really appreciating. Like, it's not like, so the thing I hated about yoga before I became like a student and scholar of it was, it wasn't yoga, but the trappings where people are always going away to a retreat or an ashram or some weird suspension of ordinary life.
Yes.
And they call that yoga, as though, and I was like, what's wrong with why can't you just change your life so you're happy there? Like why are you always having to go someplace else to sing a song or something? Why can't you just sing a song? Like, so there's a weird kind of escapism in yoga land. And actual yoga is like, you're not trying to select out the people who aren't doing yoga. You're not trying to only be friends with people. Like, you are a person. You're working on being a person. You didn't just appear in a vacuum. You have relationships with other people, and those are the people that you're going to do your practice with, right? So it's the people who are already in your life. Those are the people you're doing your practice with. And they might not know it at first, but eventually they'll start doing a bit of it too, right? Because you're creating an environment where people can take back their boundaries and work on being themselves.
Yeah. I feel like that's some of the hardest yoga is when we're in
Oh yeah,
relationship.
that's tough. But it's so satisfying when it starts to work out, right? Because what you're doing is you're not allowing yourself to just be bitter and stew in those issues and resentments you might have with this person or that person, right? You're kind of really reckoning with yourself and you not allowing yourself all that, which means sometimes you have to push back on others, but in a way that gives them the space they need, right? So often our boundaries are confused and so it's very hard to live with others then.
Yeah.
Um,
I have a neighbor who now is walking by whenever I'm in the garden. He walks right by and I mean, I haven't talked to this guy in 13 years, but he had a big loss in his life and now he walks every day and he's kind of a everyone thinks he's really grumpy and nosy. And I just thought, well, every time he comes to chat, I'm going to do my best. And yesterday he crossed the line with me and I just said, I
oh
don't
yeah.
appreciate that. I just called him on it
Yeah, good. Yeah.
very gently,
Yeah.
and he stopped right away, and then he turned the conversation, and I was like, I just have to set my boundaries, and then we can we
Yeah.
can decide if we can have a nice conversation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the other thing. Like, you have permission to, like, care for yourself, right? You don't it's not, you know, you don't owe him anything.
Yes.
But you also owe yourself a pleasant time. So, like, if you can do that when he's around, that's great. If you can't, tell him to go do something else, and you can do something else too, right? There's no weird. We're not each other's like meal. We're not each other's. There's nothing mean about this, but we get so conditioned into thinking that we have to give up something about ourselves for the sake of like niceness or relationships, or it's a weird thing we've been taught. But
Yeah. Yes. Oh my gosh, that's such a good point that I have to say, like, as a woman, I feel like
yeah,
we're really raised to, like,
yeah,
be nice and smile and be
for sure.
kind all the time, and it
Yeah.
is a bit shocking. I know it was shocking for him that I gently said it. It's not like
Mhm.
I was really sharp with
Well,
him or
it's amazing because when people speak quietly and they say something important, it can have a real impact more than just people yelling, right? Because it's heard.
yeah, he really took it in.
Yeah.
And I also wanna remember that he just had a big loss, like, he's
Yeah.
grieving.
Yeah.
So, his whole world has changed, and, uh anyway, it makes for an interesting thing of, like I'm like, "Okay, here I am showing up in relationship with this person who I did not know would be, like, sort of walking through my life when I'm in the garden more."
Yeah.
Yeah. What is there any practice where you're like, here's a great way to kind of start this, like a small baby step? Let's say if someone has a really strong connection with asana, pranayama,
Right,
going to
right.
yoga, and they're like, I don't do a lot of philosophy stuff.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that the practice is basically a moral philosophical practice. So you're not practicing yoga unless you're doing this. You're not practicing capital Y yoga. You're doing things that would be a way to practice capital Y yoga, but so I mean you just have to choose, do you want to or not? And the reason you should is because you should be your own ally and not and not settle for less. So I mean when I think about it that way, yeah, I want to be devoted to sovereignty. I should be my own ally. Why shouldn't this be my practice all the time? That only sometimes I care about myself, and the rest of the time I'm going to allow myself to be taken advantage of. Like it would be a weird decision to make. So like if you're on your, I think you owe it to yourself and others, but at least let's just start with you. And potentially says that it's really about the intensity of your commitment. There are no steps. You're diving, or you either dive in or you don't, and what you get out of it has to do with how much you put into it. And there is no reason not to dive into it. There are a lot. I can understand there might be fear and apprehension, but that's not a reason. Those are just feelings. Um, but why would you want to take a break from being on your own side? Just I don't understand. I can't think of like a real answer to that question.
Okay. So if we decide, all right, I really like this wording of like showing up for the ally for ourselves.
Yeah.
We wake up in the morning, we're like, here it is. This is my first moment of like conscious thought. What might that look like?
Oh yeah. Well, when you wake up, you have a soul. When you start to practice, what happens is you become aware of all the weird thoughts and feelings that would have just propelled you before, but now they're just like the objects of your like annoyance and amusement. And like so there's no experience that is the practice of yoga. It's how you relate to these things, right? So if you wake up and you find yourself disoriented, then you have to choose to do something to help yourself out of that, right? It's about the choosing and the doing. It isn't so much about the experience. And that's the other weird thing about like Yoga Land yoga, right? It's all about coping with the effects of repression. So everybody wants to feel happy or not in pain or calm. But an actual yoga practice is like, it's a kriya, it's an activity, it's agitating. It's supposed to be agitating. You're supposed to kind of shake yourself up, not get used to, get rid of the cobwebs, allow yourself to live a very active life. And that's a really dynamic thing. It will involve all sorts of experiences and all sorts of, you get up and you're gonna have to eat at some point, care for yourself, clean up. You might probably will have like some kind of occupation, right? Or something like there's no ordinary thing that you have to do that isn't really just the thing that you have to do as part of your yoga practice. So this is the weird thing about yoga line. Yoga is like something you schedule it in, and then everything else is not yoga. Like if you're actually practicing everything, like this is part of my practice right now, having this chat with you. What does it feel like? Well, I see your face, so that's kind of part of it. This is nice. There are less pleasant things that I do in a day, but there would still be like, I don't know, having to clean out the green bin or something like like that would be an unpleasant experience, but like it would still be part of my practice.
Oh my gosh, I like this so much, especially for the person who feels like, I don't know, like I did in early days where I was like, I have to roll up my mat. I need there to be like
Yeah,
quiet. Maybe I'll play some music. I'll light a candle because this is what yoga is like. Yeah.
that's a
Oh,
spa treatment. That's nice. I like spas. I think spas are amazing. When I would go on the smells, I'm like, why can't my house smell like this all the time? It's so funny, right? Instead of the really strange artificial environment, I was like, could I live in a place that was like this? That's fine, you know, but that's just what it is.
I
You can
love
have that without the yoga practice, and you can do the yoga practice without the spa.
Right. Oh my gosh, yes, we could go to the spa and just be, like, all in our head
Yeah.
about our grocery list or something and not be in the moment at all.
Or maybe
Um,
that's just what you need to do. Like, I mean, in the yoga practice, like this in the moment thing, like, I also think that that's actually also something um, that's foisted on a yoga practice because, and when we're practicing yoga, we have to be thinking about what's coming up. I know how to get in the car and just be in the moment. Like, I'm thinking about where I'm going. I'm thinking about where I came from. I'm anticipating what other people could be doing. That's a responsible way to drive,
right.
right? It would be really weird to go, oh no, I'm not going to wear it just in the moment. That'd be a completely irresponsible way to drive. But
That's the way
I
dogs would
think,
drive, you know that. It's
say
like
that again.
that's the way dogs would drive.
They would just drive in the moment.
Maybe not, maybe not. Maybe
No,
dogs
my
are
my
gonna
dog knows our route, and she gets very upset if you deviate. So she's always thinking about what's supposed to be happening ahead, and it's just, how else are you going to function without this past and future awareness, right? It's
okay.
a very important part of a yoga practice that we open up in both ways, right? We understand where we're coming from. We have a plan about where we're going, and this is part of what it is for us to be unconservative and self-governing.
Okay, are we gonna see in our lifetime, you and I, an end to colonization?
Oh, that is the wrong question to ask, I
I
think.
love it when you tell me it's the wrong question.
Because that's, who knows? The question I think we should be asking is, like, will we see more people engage in decolonization? Because that's, I think, like, if we can get rid of the idea that we just should do what we're told, and we just are these people who are defined by our family histories and the language and culture we're in, everything will start to get better. Like, the more people who can function that way, the more the world will just be a different kind of place. So it may not be an all or nothing thing, but um, it's something we could do. It's not impossible, and it's also not difficult. It's just not encouraged, right? So there's nothing that encourages us to take on this yoga practice, really. But we can all do it. And so, the nice thing about a yoga practice is that because you're just working on your practice, you're not thinking about outcomes. You're not going to get discouraged that things are bad. And maybe we'll just all boil off the face of the earth in 50 years. Like, maybe that'll all happen. But that's not what I'm worried about when I'm practicing, right? Because how do I control that anyways? I don't. But if I can transform myself enough, and then in transforming myself enough, provide a kind of model for others and kind of nudge them that way too, there can be an important domino effect in the way that we people behave. Because these big problems, they're macro problems that come from lots of agents making bad choices. So if more agents start to make good choices, like, we can shift things. But we're not going to be able to do that if we're just worried about whether we're going to be successful or not, which is also in the Gita, right? Don't worry about all the outcomes. Just do your practice, just be devoted, and there's no other way to be successful. So I can say this: the only way that colonization will come to an end is if enough of us engage in this yoga practice. But in order to do that, you got to stop worrying about what that can't be your carrot on the stick. Um,
Oh,
the
that's so
ending
good.
oppression. Yeah, it would be nice, but, like,
Your answer really makes me think that it is, like each person as an individual, instead of I just wake up tomorrow and someone has announced like this is the end of colonization.
Well, as a Canadian, I think we have a lot of work to do because we live in a really weird, and anybody in the Anglosphere, in the US or Australia, live in a weird environment where colonization is just like our countries are basically colonial entities. They're created this way. And even the way we learn about Indigenous people, they're treated as though they're these like specimens, these bubbles. We're not supposed to be Indigenous. We're supposed to always be It's weird. It's really weird, right? We have to accept that we're settlers. We have to listen to Indigenous people. So none of the discourse is really encouraged for us to decolonize. We're always kind of encouraged to accept this colonization as part of who we are and how we live. And so, the work we need to do is, so much of this is like, if we're expecting other people to be clear-headed, it's just not going to happen. Like we have to do this work ourselves. And then, just like the wake up in the morning and then, I was like, well, the funny thing about a yoga practice is all these thoughts and feelings become what you're aware of, right? What would have just propelled you before, you're like, that's weird, right? You start the whole universe that we live in, it becomes like absurd. Like you just start to see how absurd so much of it is, but that's also kind of not your problem, right? Like your problem is yourself. And that's a simpler thing to deal with.
Yeah. A simpler, complicated thing.
Yeah.
That's so true. This is also what I appreciate is somewhere in your book it said, this is what's going to sustain you if you're showing up in activism work, because it's not like you're going to be like, check, we've done that.
Yes.
Now we'll just go to the spa for the rest of the
Right.
lifetime.
Well, or what happens is people, they put in unrealistic energy into unrealistic expectations as though marches and rallies are going to do something. They're important to raise awareness, but they're not the instrument that brings down oppression or something. And a lot of times people think, if I just put everything else on hold and really work on this one issue, then it'll be solved and I'll be able to go back to my life. That just doesn't happen. So you have to live your life as you do your tapas. Really, this is about your tapas. And so then there has to be a way of just kind of going forward as the new normal, as an agitator.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I want to hear what our listeners have to say about this. I want them to read your book. It's really quite captivating. Don't let the philosophy word scare you that it's not going to be engaging. It's super engaging. Thank you so much for writing this and doing this work.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad that it's useful for people. That's really, writing a book is a really weird thing. Is this you and the page, and you have no idea how it's all going to turn out, right? And it's a very lonely process. So it's kind of weird on the other end. And once it's in public, you're off to doing other things. So it's kind of neat to hear back from people that it's landing, that it means something.
Definitely landing. Someone doesn't have to have studied yoga for years to be able to read it, for sure. And you could keep going back to it and reading just a little paragraph or something. But I'll tell you, you will get sucked in. That's what I did. I was like, I'm just going to read one chapter. Oh, wait, I'm now going past my reading limit. So thank you.
That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, it's so good. Tell our listeners again, what's your website?
Yeah. So it's yogaphilosophy.com. It's getting an overhaul, but you can still find me there, yogaphilosophy.com. And then I'm also on Instagram at yogaphilosophy_com.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much, Shannon.
Connected yoga teachers, I would love to hear from you on what was your key takeaway from this conversation today with Shyam. If you're on social media, tag us Tell us, what was your key takeaway today? You can also tag OfferingTree, who makes this podcast possible, and tag Shyam. He's on Instagram, as he said. And it's very likely that he'll answer you back if you have questions, further questions. Definitely check out his book. Thank you again, Shyam, for coming on the podcast and sharing all of this wisdom. And thank you again for being open to looking at where are we right now as humans? What's going on with us as a collective community? And then what's going on with us as individuals? And I hope some of my examples of what's been going on in my own life were okay thrown in there. I feel like philosophy is really rooted for me when I think of just the day-to-day things that go on for humans, and then seeing how yoga philosophy applies to that. If you are enjoying the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. You can comment on the show notes page with any questions or thoughts or ideas. So the show notes are over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/395 for this episode. Also, if you haven't left us a review, it helps other yoga teachers to find our podcast. So you can do that through Apple Podcasts, or you can do it on any podcast app. Leave a review and let us know. What are your questions? What's your feedback? And thank you so much for supporting the podcast. Thank you so much to our whole team over here that brings this podcast to life each week. And thank you, dear listener. You really are the heart and soul of this podcast. And I'm so grateful that you're here. I'm grateful for the time that you've spent hanging out, learning about yoga philosophy and how we can build in decolonization work into this and how that really is what yoga is. And before we sign off here and say goodbye until next episode, you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you a question. And that question is, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?